Nothing like some overblown music that you come for wildcard weekend in the NFL playoffs. And to talk about that and some other things, I suspect, I'm delighted to say we're joined by the Ringer's John Gonzalez. John, how are you?
Good, all things considered. Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, all things considered, let's try and consider some of the things that have been happening this week in the United States. The intersection of sport and race and politics has actually been a fairly consistent part of your outgoing president's tenure and the build-up to that. So as a sports journalist watching what happened this week, what the hell did you make about what had happened and the tipping point that we now seem to have reached in American society?
Yeah, I feel like every time I come on with you guys, it's ostensibly to talk about sports, and invariably it ends up being about unrest in America and the deep division that we have in this country. And I think what happened at the Capitol the other day was deeply upsetting, deeply disappointing, but unfortunately not surprising. This is something that's been simmering and building, and then it boiled over in the country for quite some time now, since before Donald Trump took office, for sure, but definitely since he assumed the presidency, he's fomented and incited this kind of reaction from his followers. And this, I think, was all too predictable. And the way that the world reacted to it, watching it, I think, with deep sadness and shock, was right, because that's what we felt here.
In this part of the world, a lot of us ended up tuning into the 5 or 6 days of the election coverage on CNN. And so for that reason, the fact that the two runoffs in Georgia happened so quickly afterwards, there was a lot more interest in this part of the world than there would traditionally have been in Senate runoff elections in the United States. And there was a sports element to that as well, which kind of has actually been overshadowed this week by virtue of everything else that happened. One of the two sitting Republicans was an owner of one of the WNBA teams in Atlanta, Georgia, and several of the team campaigned against her election, against her re-election. She lost her seat, and she was, interestingly, one of the people who were the first Republicans to then subsequently turn on Donald Trump in the aftermath when the joint congressional hearings were held to certify the election results. There's been a mad intersection of that aspect of the story, and then, not surprisingly, it was the NBA players, again, who were leading talking points in the aftermath of the storming of the Capitol, pointing out that if these were Black Lives Matter protesters, then the response would have been an entirely different point, which ultimately then gets echoed by the president-elect, Joe Biden, 24 hours later. So again, it's clear that there's been a sea change in how athletes view themselves and their role in speaking up and being agents of change. I wonder, has anybody had a chance to talk about that just yet in the American sports media, or is everybody still focused on the fact that this situation is still unfolding?
Well, for sure, everybody's focused on the fact that the situation is still unfolding. But I think that what you brought up has been something that's been discussed for a while now. I mean, Kelly Loeffler, who's the outgoing senator from Georgia who lost her race to Reverend Raphael Warnock, had been campaigning on this really divisive platform, this race-baiting platform, and the WNBA stood up against it from the beginning, from the runoff, the general election, up through this runoff that she just lost. I mean, they were out in the forefront campaigning against her, saying that she had been race-baiting and campaigning on this really divisive platform. And they were, in addition to Stacey Abrams, who had lost her gubernatorial race in 2018 against the current governor, Brian Kemp in Georgia, had been really instrumental in getting out the vote in Georgia. And then, as you mentioned, with NBA players, when we saw when they were in the bubble in Orlando, they took a role at the fore when all of the social unrest and protests were happening here in the United States, and they've continued to do so. I wrote a story in September for The Ringer discussing how many of the owners in the NBA had contributed heavily to the Republican Party and Donald Trump, and how that had become a point of contention for NBA players, and they let their voices be known about it. And I think that you could draw a direct line to voter turnout in Georgia to athletes who had said, you know, enough, and let's do our part, and let's do everything that we can to change things.
I know it must seem, when you're watching this unfold on your TV, and it's supposed to be a fairly straightforward ceremonial thing where the president who wins the election ends up being certified. And I'd say in the past, it's been kind of a nice day for the families and that kind of stuff. All of a sudden, there's like riots happening in the seat of legislative power. At the same time, there has been that moment where athletes have realized that they aren't just a marketing tool for sports shoes or fizzy drinks or for automobile companies, that they've begun to use that power for social change. That's like in an organized way. Obviously, we've seen in American history the protests in the 1968 games in Mexico City. There have been standout individuals all the way back to Muhammad Ali and before that as well. But for it to be as organized and concentrated and articulate and sustained, it feels to me like post-Kaepernick and pre-Kaepernick are going to be an era of American sports social history where we think in different terms about what the role of the athlete is. Is that fair, or am I stretching a bit too much?
No, I think that dividing line, that before and after Kaepernick, is a really interesting one. I mean, you're right. There have always been instances of athletes being willing to speak their mind and protest and point out certainly things that are wrong and the deep division here in America. However, I think lately it's been more prevalent. I think that dividing line that you're talking about is one of numbers, where previously I think that the norm was more often that athletes were reluctant to speak out and speak up. I think, people frequently bring up Michael Jordan saying that Republicans also buy sneakers, right? And that might be an apocryphal saying. He might not have actually said that, but the sentiment, I think, really underscores the reluctance previously of athletes to wade into politics. And now we're well past that. I mean, now just the other night you saw Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown give a statement after the game. You've seen Steve Kerr and Greg Popovich's comments. Greg Popovich gave a long statement yesterday about what he thought had happened and why it had happened. And I think it's important to note there that he's worked for the Holt family for over 2 decades now. And the Holt family has contributed. They're one of the biggest, our reporting found that they're one of the biggest contributors to Republican politics and Donald Trump over the last 5 years in the NBA. So he's somebody who doesn't exactly have cover from his ownership for that. And I think it goes on and on and on in the NFL. I mean, and the NBA, where we've seen players take a knee after what happened at the Capitol the other day. And this comes too, we should remember, when we've seen right-wing politicians and supporters in America saying that kneeling was something that was disrespectful. Kneeling during the American anthem was disrespectful to the country. And yet we see what happened when their followers are actually motivated and what they're capable of.
Yeah, I mean, they were referred to as patriots by the First Lady in her tweet, calling them to, maybe calm down a little bit, but you are definitely patriots and heroes, and you can just see the dog whistling and the language that's being used by those politicians. But it will be very interesting to see what happens in the future too. Just one kind of corollary to this is there were a number of former sports people who did come out in favor of Trump in the election. I'm thinking in particular of Jack Nicklaus, who wrote and tweeted a quite long piece about why he was supporting Trump, left out the fact that Trump had given money to a children's hospital that was going to bear the Jack Nicklaus name. And then there were a couple of other ex-NFL players, and Conor McGregor came out for him as well. So it was kind of, it was interesting to see that there are some people who are going to end up with that on their record. And, I wonder what's going to happen. Will we begin to see more people coming out on both sides in the future to endorse these people? And obviously, I think Bill Belichick had famously stumped for Trump in the past as well.
Yeah, Belichick, Tom Brady. I mean, there are people who have been affiliated with the MAGA movement for some time now who I think haven't exactly been shy about it. Again, NBA ownership across the board has contributed massive amounts of money to Republican politics and to Donald Trump in specific. So I think there might be some sort of hesitation now to really throw their arms around him completely and fully. We saw some politicians even trying to back away from it. You mentioned Kelly Loeffler, who just the night before the riots in Washington, D.C., there was a rally in Georgia where she said that she was going to go to the Capitol and contest the election results in Georgia and Arizona and Pennsylvania and other states that didn't vote for Donald Trump, where he had alleged without any evidence whatsoever that there had been great fraud. And then the next day, when they stormed the Capitol, she all of a sudden reconsiders and decides not to vote against the certification, probably because it finally ultimately dawned on her what this kind of incendiary rhetoric can unleash. So maybe, you know, for some of the supporters who can still feel a modicum of shame, they might be backing away from it. But I also am doubtful of that, because I don't think that the MAGA movement and Trumpism lends itself to feeling shame. I mean, if it had, we wouldn't have seen the events of the last 4 years.
No. Or self-reflection, or
right.
or understanding that they're responsible or taking responsibility for any of this.
Right.
So, yeah, as he made the point in his kind of concession speech about the orderly transition, he said they're not. This isn't the end. They've only got started. So we'll see where that goes. Against that backdrop, there are some brilliant football matches this weekend. If my segue is not too clunky here, do you expect any protests from players? Any kind of political discourse around these? There's been, you know, it's easier in some respects for the NFL, the NBA players, given how central a role they all play. The teams are much smaller. The NFL players who have spoken out in the past have, in many cases, found themselves without a team, not immediately, but frequently soon enough.
Yeah, I think in the NBA, the league has often positioned itself as one of free speech, of one that leans left, one where the players are, they have agency maybe that NFL players aren't often afforded. And you'd mentioned the before and after Colin Kaepernick dividing line. I think that there might be the usual kneeling, group kneeling for certain players that we've seen over the last few years. And then ultimately they'll go and play football, because the NFL hasn't really positioned itself at the fore of these social protests and as a voice speaking out against it. But it has been strange. I mean, it was strange to watch basketball happen the night that the Capitol was breached, and that there was rioting and looting, and people died, and they still played basketball. So I don't think that it's surprising that the NFL is going to go forward with playoff football, and in a way, maybe it's cathartic. Maybe it's at the very least some sort of diversion, because right now everything here feels chaotic and mad and without purpose. So maybe a distraction is what people need.
I mean, it's just been such a weird time all over the world. Like, we were on the verge of having at least a hiatus in a major international rugby competition here for the next while. The fact that the NFL have reached this point of the season without postponing any games. I mean, there were a few cases where they set them back a week or two. And there were a few other cases where clearly if a team had been in contention, you would expect the game might have been postponed. There's a logistical achievement there that they're not going to get much credit for, because they're a multi-billion-dollar organization. But at the same time, it is remarkable that we're on target to finish the season with the Super Bowl being scheduled for the time that it was originally scheduled for.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, here we are, we've gone this entire interview, and we're not just now getting to COVID and the ripple effects for sports writ large, and then in specific for the NFL. And you're right, they have bumped back all these weeks, or teams that didn't have really their bye weeks because of COVID outbreaks, and yet they are going to, it looks like, ostensibly finish out the season and the postseason, which is no small feat in and of itself, especially because when you look at, you say this weekend, the Cleveland Browns will be in the playoffs for the first time in quite some time. They're the longest drought of any team in the NFL. They're playing their arch rival, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And just this week, after that momentous achievement, they had a rash of COVID outbreaks where a number of players who might otherwise be in the playoffs for the first time in their career look like they're not going to be available. Their head coach, Kevin Stefanski, who's done an incredible job with them. Now they've got an interim head coach who knows if he'll be available. So yeah, they're going to make it happen. I think part of that is commendable and is owed to resolve, but it's also unfortunate, and it speaks to how chaotic the times are right now, that it's really just they're figuring it out as they go.
Yeah, and look, I mean, we kind of think that we would all like to see match where title was on the line and it was two candidates for the MVP up against each other. But we could reach a situation where they might both reach the Super Bowl and neither of them could play because there's a COVID outbreak. It is kind of wild that you just have to stay alive from this point on, and there's a good chance that you're going to make it all the way.
Yeah, right. Exactly right. I mean, you cross your fingers and you hope that everybody does what they're supposed to do in terms of wearing masks and social distancing and being tested regularly and contact tracing and all of that. But there's so many variables here that go into it that are completely unknown. I mean, beyond the fact that you just have all of these players that you have to keep healthy and the coaches and the support staff, the logistics that go into putting on an NFL game in any city, let alone a Super Bowl, are significant. And on top of it, the Super Bowl this year is in Tampa Bay, Florida, where Florida has been one of the hot spots the entire time that we've had this pandemic outbreak over this last year, and has been reluctant to force people to wear masks. They have a governor in Florida, Ron DeSantis, who's sort of a Trump loyalist, who's been a truther about COVID outbreaks and COVID information, and had tried to keep part of that from the public. So you've got that extra element of the unknown layered on top of it. So yeah, they look like they're going to finish this out, and kudos for them, but it won't be because it was easy.
Can I just ask you one last question at the end of this about the Philadelphia Eagles and their version of the inelegant tank last week? It's like, wow, that's some naked level jiggery pokery, we would call it in this part of the world.
Yeah, so a lot of people were very angry about that here. I understand why they did it. As you know, the Philadelphia 76ers, the basketball team, had tanked for quite some time in order to improve their long-term prospects. It's something that we're quite aware of in Philadelphia. I think it tended to rankle people outside of Philadelphia a lot more, especially in New York. And for Philadelphians, that was sort of an added bonus. But I understand why people got upset that they didn't play to win that game. But ultimately, that game mattered not at all for them. And they could have given up 5 draft slots if they had won it. And by losing it, a game that didn't matter to them, they move up higher and they potentially position themselves to get a player that's more impactful. So I get why they did it, and I also understand why people were angry. But were I in their shoes, I likely would have authorized the same thing.
All right, that's you can't say fairer than that, to be honest. I mean, that's the whole point. It's the intelligent fans understanding this as opposed to the naked anger that they feel. I had not counted in the bit, though, that annoying New Yorkers is actually a big part of the victory that the Philly fans are going to feel again.
That alone would have made me do it.
Tom, good stuff. Thanks a million for joining us. Cheers.
Always love being on. Thanks so much.